Iron Man 2 movie review. So this movie came out 10 years ago now, and at this point in time, it may be interesting to compare our perceptions of what the reception of this movie has been. My memory is that there was a lot of hype when it first came out in 2010, and a lot of positive goodwill towards it. People were really excited about this movie, even though it got some lackluster reviews initially. I think the general public was very welcoming of it. There was a buzz, people were talking about it. And then after that hype died down, then the backlash set in. A couple, 2, 3, 4 years later, where people were making a lot of complaints about this movie on YouTube video essays, talking about everything that was wrong with this movie, of which I think the primary complaint, as I recall, was that this was a classic example of Marvel Studios prioritizing tie-ins and continuity over a coherent story arc. In other words, they were trying to cram in too many different things that would later set up for different sequels, which ended up sacrificing this movie's story, the coherence of this movie itself. And then I think we're at where we are today, where this movie is largely forgotten. And in my opinion, it deserves to be largely forgotten. It's a largely forgettable movie. It starts out with a pretty lackluster beginning. It then moves into a short and unspectacular action scene. And then the movie just seems to tread water for an hour. Well, Tony Stark has a personal crisis, which I found boring. And then Tony Stark works through his father issues, which I found doubly boring. And then we get to the big climactic action scene at the end, which admittedly is not half bad. But I'm sure it looked much better on the big cinema screen. I ended up watching it on TV, on DVD, and on my small TV screen, much of the flying robots, chases, and explosions were wasted on the small screen. So it was definitely not the best movie I've ever seen. On the other hand, there were several things that worked well about it. Robert Downey Jr. is great, of course, as he was in the first Iron Man. A friend of mine once said to me, he said, all these Iron Man movies aren't really that great. If Robert Downey Jr. wasn't in them, they would all be awful. Which is probably true, but so what? There are tons of movies that are saved purely by the actors that carry them. And Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark, Iron Man, is able to carry a lot of this movie. Sam Rockwell, I thought, was also good, playing against Robert Downey Jr. Rockwell plays Hammer, a man in the same line of work as Tony Stark, and someone who thinks he is able to joke and smooze just as well as Tony Stark, but whose constant jabbering just comes off as annoying instead. For instance, when trying to sell weapons, Hammer jabbers about a special bullet. He says, "It's capable of busting a bunker under the bunker you just busted. If it were any smarter, it would write a book that would make Ulysses look like it was written in crayon, and then it would read it to you." Now, that all comes off as really annoying and not funny, but I think it works within the context of the movie, because the conceit is this Hammer guy is supposed to be annoying and not funny, as compared to Tony Stark, who is a genuine article. So I thought that part worked. And even though the story lags a bit, the writing is not altogether terrible. There's some clever foreshadowing going on, where Vanko is muttering about how there will be no men in the suit and how the drones are going to be better. At the end of the movie, we find out exactly why he was planning this and what he was going to use it for. I also thought it was clever that the method by which Iron Man and War Machine defeat Vanko was also something they had discovered by accident earlier in the movie. Okay, I'm going to talk now a little bit about continuity between this movie and some of the other Marvel movies. I've already mentioned that I think a main backlash or main criticism against this movie was that it was trying to shoehorn in too many tie-ins to other elements from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, setting up other movies, and as a consequence, people say that the coherence of this movie suffered. And I don't know, maybe that's true, but I actually like it. I love seeing all these tie-ins to other movies. When I was a kid getting into comics, this was something that really attracted me to comics. The fact that it wasn't just one story, it was a web of stories. And so some plot element that would be introduced in one comic book would later go off and continue on in another comic book. And I do realize there's a cynical element to this, meaning the comic book companies are just trying to milk as much cash out of you as possible. I think this was especially true in the 1990s when I was into comic books, back when comic books were still big business, which I'm not sure they are now. But anyways, in spite of the fact that I recognize an element of it was cynical, I just was fascinated by just this web of stories where plot lines were weaving in and out of different comic book series. And the attempt to bring the same element to the big screen is something I welcome. It's something it's an experiment I find interesting. Although, once again, here, I do know that there's a cynical element to this. You know, they're just trying to make as much money off of these movies and bring as many people back for the sequels as possible. But I still think it's pretty cool. So in this movie, Captain America's shield makes a cameo appearance. The Scarlet Widow is first introduced in this movie. And Nick Fury has his first expanded role in this movie. He'd been introduced before, but he'd never played a major part in any of the movies before. Also, there's a post-credit teaser, which is leading into the Thor movie. And yet, there are still hints that the writers might not have had everything perfectly planned out at the beginning. The beginning of the Marvel series, I mean. Because at the end of the Incredible Hulk movie, Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark makes an appearance at the end of that movie to say he's putting a team together, which would imply that he is putting the team together. He's in charge of the Avengers. Now, in this movie, Tony Stark is on the outside of the Avengers, and it's Nick Fury's project. So, I'm sure you could invent a way to kind of marry those two accounts, but I'm going to count it as a continuity gap. There's also the issue of keeping the actors consistent, which with any franchise that goes on as long as Marvel has, is bound to run into hiccups sooner or later. People will die. People will get drug addictions and need to go into rehab. People will be unavailable to sign contracts for whatever reason. And that happens, and you just, as a fan, you have to accept it. But if that doesn't happen, and the actor is perfectly willing to reprise his role, and you replace him anyways, then that strikes me as not taking fully advantage of the whole concept of a shared universe and continuity over several movies. In this case, the character of War Machine got replaced. It was originally Terrence Howard, and they replaced him with James Rhodes. According to Wikipedia, Terrence Howard was not happy about this. He said, again, this is from Wikipedia, there was no explanation. Apparently the contracts that we write and sign aren't worth the paper that they're printed on sometimes. Promises aren't kept, and good faith negotiations aren't always held up. Now, I actually really like Don Cheadle. I've considered him one of my favorite underrated actors even before he joined the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I really liked him in Ocean's 11 and the sequels, and a few other things he's popped up in, which I really liked. But I think it was a mistake to switch the actors out. It would have been better to just keep continuity. It's water under the bridge at this point. It's way too late to change it now. But I think it was a bad decision, even though I really like Don Cheadle. Okay, one final note. This is a bit random, but You remember there was a plot point in this movie where Vanko kept asking for his bird. What was the deal with that? I thought that was going to develop into a plot point, but it never ended up going anywhere. He just complained about how he didn't get the bird that he wanted. And then that was the end of that thread? I don't know. Does anyone know? Did I miss something? Was that something that got cut out in editing? Was that... if anyone has any insight into that, let me know. Genuinely curious as to what happened with that. Okay.